had concentrated on Ed. It was pretty hungry, and it was in rich pickings now. Ed had always kept from disturbing game close to the cabin, partly because he liked to see it around, and partly because he had an idea that some day he might be in a fix where he couldn't travel very well, and would want close meat to hand. The Harn felt no such compunctions. The stinging units spread through the woods, and shortly a steady procession of loaded carriers began to stream back through the hole. Ed picked off the first few, but then the Harn found it could route them up the river trail in such a way that he got only a glimpse as they flashed through the hole. After that he did not hit very many. Ed stopped shooting. He was getting short on ammunition for the .30 now, too. He counted up. There were 18 rounds for the .450, half a box of 220-grain soft point for the .30, plus about the same amount of military stuff, and a handful of shotgun shells. Of course, there was still the .30 Luger with a couple of boxes, and the .22, but they were not much account for this kind of work. He looked at the cabin door. It was stout, built of hewed 3-inch slabs, but it wouldn't last forever against the kind of beating the gate had got. Even if it did, he was going to run out of water eventually. Ed thought about that for a while, sitting at the table staring at the little pile of cartridges. He was going to be run out of here sooner or later. He might as well pick his own time, and now seemed about as good as any, while the Harn was busy exploring and hunting. He sighed and got up to rummage around the cabin. The snake-proof pants had done real good, but he did not trust them entirely. There was some sheet iron laid over the ceiling joists, which he had brought up to make new stoves for his line camps. He got this down and cut it into small pieces. Around the edges he drilled a number of small holes. Then he got out his mending gear and began sewing the plates, in an overlapping pattern, to the legs of the snake-proof pants and to an old pair of moccasins. When he finished, he was pretty well armored as far as his crotch. It was an awkward outfit to move around in, but as long as he was able to stay on his feet, he figured he could be reasonably secure from the stingers. As for the bigger ones, he would just have to depend on seeing them first, and the .450. Next, he needed some gasoline. The fuel cache was under a big spruce about 20 yards from the door. He made the round of his loopholes. There were no Harn in sight. They were apparently ignoring him for now. He slipped out the door, closing it securely behind him, and started for the cache. As he stepped out, a stinger came from under the sill log and lashed at his foot. He killed it with the axe beside the door, saving a cartridge, and went on, walking fairly fast but planting his feet carefully, a little awkward in his armor. He picked up a 5-gallon can of gas, a quart of motor oil, and the 20 feet of garden hose he used for siphoning gas down the bank to the boat. On the way back, another stinger hit him. He kicked it aside, not wanting to set down his load, and it came at him again and again. Just outside the door, he finally caught it under a heel and methodically trampled it to death. Then he snatched open the door, tossed the stuff inside, and pulled it quickly shut behind him. So far, so good. He lashed the gas can solidly to his packboard, slipped the end of the hose into the flexible spout, and wired it tight. Then he cut up an old wool undershirt and wrapped the pieces around miscellaneous junk, old nuts and bolts, chunks of lead line, anything to make up half a dozen packages of good throwing heft. He soaked these in oil and stowed them in a musette bag, which he snapped to the D-rings of the pack. One of the metal plates on his moccasin was hanging by a thread. Probably he had torn it loose in the scuffle at the door. They weren't going to take too much kicking and banging around, he could see, and once he was on his way, it wouldn't be a very good idea to be caught bending over with his bare hands at ground level to fix them. On the other hand, he couldn't be using all his cartridges on the stingers either. He had to save them for the carriers. He thought about this some while mending the moccasins, and decided to take the bug gun. It might not kill the stingers, but it ought to discourage them enough so they wouldn't keep pestering him. With his bad left arm, he had trouble getting the pack on his back. He finally managed by swinging it up on the table first. It was not too much of a load, 40 or 50 pounds, he guessed. Still, shaky as he was, it was about as much as he could manage. He had intended to just try it on for size, but after he got it up, he thought, well, why not now? He picked up the 450, stowed the extra cartridges in his pocket, checked to make sure he had matches, hung the bug gun on his belt, and opened the door. It was just getting dusk, but the other world was in broad daylight. The days and nights were almost completely reversed again. As he stepped through the hole, the first stinger struck. He gave it a good squirt of tobacco juice. It went bucking and twisting off, and he went on, stepping carefully and solidly. Luckily, most of the Harn was foraging in the new world. 2 more stingers ambushed him, but the tobacco juice got rid of them, and he had no serious trouble till he got close to the den. 2 carriers came out and rushed him there. He shot them both, and then killed the stinger that was pecking at his shins. He moved quickly now. He had an idea that in about a minute all hell would break loose. He swung the pack down on the uphill side of the den, wet the musette bag with a quick spray of gas, tossed it over his shoulder, jammed the free end of the hose into the den mouth, and stabbed the can with his knife to vent it. As the gas poured into the den, he lit one of his oil and gas-soaked bombs and ran around in front, lighting one after another from the one in his hand and tossing them into the den. The musette bag caught fire, and he snatched it from his shoulder and tossed it after the bombs. A whoof, and a sheet of flame blew out. About 50 yards away there was a slender popple-like tree. Ed thought if he could make that, he would be reasonably secure while the Harn burned. He ran for it as hard as he could, beating at the flames that had spattered on him from the burning gas, but he never made it. Harn were erupting everywhere. A carrier suddenly came charging out of the brush to his left. While Ed dealt with that one, the Harn played its ace in the hole. The 2 special units it had been developing to deal with Ed were not quite done yet, but they were done enough to work for the few minutes the Harn needed them. Ed heard a coughing grunt behind him and spun around to see something new crawling out of the flame and smoke at the den entrance. This one was a roughly carrier-shaped creature, but half again as large, built for killing. It had powerful fanged jaws, and its 8 feet were armed with knife-like disemboweling claws, and it came at Ed in a lumbering rush. Another came crawling out after it. Ed shot 4 times, as fast as he could work the action. The heavy slugs did the job, but not quite well enough. With its dying lunge, the thing got to him and tossed him 10 feet like a rag doll. He lit on his bad hand and felt the wrist bones go. As he struggled to get up, digging his elbow in and using one hand, he saw a stinger darting in at him. He had lost both the bug gun and his rifle when the fighting unit swiped him. He swiveled on his hips and kicked the stinger away. Then he saw the second fighting unit coming. He forgot about the stinger. It still might get to him, but if it did, it would be too late to matter. He drew his knife, managed to get to one knee, and crouched there like an old gray rat, stubbly lips drawn back from worn teeth in a grin of pain and rage. This was one he wasn't going to win, he guessed. 10 feet away, the fighting unit suddenly ran down like a clockwork toy. It toppled over, skidded past him under its own momentum, and lay there, kicking spasmodically. Ed glared at it uncomprehendingly. It arched its neck back to almost touch its haunches, stiffened, and was still. Ed looked around. The stinger was dead, too, 3 feet from his shoulder, and half a dozen more, which had been making for him. A cloud of greasy, stinking smoke was rolling out of the den. The Harn was dead. Ed put his knife away and lay back. He did not quite pass out, but things got pretty dim. After a while he got hold of himself and sat up. He was not too surprised to see the man in forest green prodding at the bodies of the fighting units. The stranger looked at the smoke still oozing from the den and nodded approvingly. Then he came over and looked at Ed. He clacked his tongue in concern and bent over, touching Ed's wrist. Ed noticed there was now a cast on it, and it didn't hurt so much. There was also a